Good afternoon. Welcome to the final session of Day 2 of Summit 2017. Just give you a second to wrap up your chat. I love working with GBMSM. I'm like, okay, the session's starting. Everyone's like, we need our break. We're taking our break, Jody. Thank you for joining us for the final session of Summit 2017. We had a comment yesterday that it was a fairly prep-heavy agenda, and we recognize that. And so already we're starting to plan for next year, and we're thinking about revisiting mental health and substance use. We did a mental health summit a few years ago, but we know that so many of the links to our current health come from a past of trauma or mental illness or simply minority stress. And we want to further explore that next year. So expect to see more of that in the program next year. I've got a couple of housekeeping items. So there is an overflow room in 1700 that is up and running. If anybody needs some space or some fresh air or more air in general, feel free to use that. Or you're welcome to, there's still lots of seats in here as well. Also, I wanted to just remind everybody that tomorrow we're having our Community Connections Day at XY. That's from 1 until 5 p.m. There'll be a CBR workshop that will inform the Sex Now survey for the first half of that. And then we've got 4 great community presenters who are going to talk about their work and their activism. Other housekeeping, you'll see the End HIV Criminalization survey is up here. Please take an opportunity to visit that. And then below it, you'll remember we're promoting a prep letter that will kick an email to the minister and also one to your local MLA. So if you're interested in going to that, please go to youthco.org. Thanks to both of Positive Living and Youthco for making that happen. So our moderator for today's session is Travis Sylliboy. He's a PhD in epidemiology, and he currently works at the BC CDC. He's a former board member of CBRC, I think a decade, maybe? A very long time, yes. And he currently sits on our research committee. We're a big fan of Travis, and we're happy that he's going to moderate our last session. Thanks, Travis.
Thanks. I want to start by thanking Fred and Marie, Camille, and Roberto, and David and Joanne for their excellent panel this morning. I kind of think of our panel as a continuation of that. They really planted some amazing ideas and concepts about how mental health fits in with this idea of combination prevention. So we're going to hear from 3 of us. Each of us will take about 15 minutes to present. We'll take questions immediately after each speaker. I'm really looking forward to hearing you talk. So let's start. The first presenter is John Sylliboy from the Millbrook First Nation. John has extensive experience in health policy, community development, and research for Atlantic First Nations. He is a co-founder of the W2SA, a regional organization that aims to build supports in education, health, and well-being for Two-Spirits in the Atlantic region. Please welcome John.
Hey there. I just wanted to first start off by doing a selfie with our group and our audience. Part of our sharing of stories is to build that story, and this is part of that story. So come on over. So you guys are behind us, right? You guys are. Got it? Wave, everyone. Thank you. Thank you. All right, technology here. It's always fun. I want to acknowledge unceded territory here, and I also want to acknowledge the fact that we have Indigenous people and Indigenous species and Indigenous knowledge in this unceded territory. That's very important. So, so Two-Spirit resilience through coming out narratives. Narratives, someone said yesterday, were part of that story building, and a lot of our points of view and cultural values and traditions, and even our cultural survival comes from that oral tradition. And part of that oral tradition is to understand that we come from a story building nation. That's where our knowledge is embedded. Our language and our knowledge around culture, or anything that has to do with culture and how we move forward in that sense of survival and resilience, is part of that. So the Two-Spirit gathering that we had back in 2010 was out of necessity. In our community, one of our communities, we had 10 suicides, and 4 were identified as two-spirited, or someone that was in the realm of identity that had to do with two-spirit. And we didn't know that. But it was families that came to us and they said, you have a responsibility, and that is to know what's happening in our communities. And not only that, but you also have to know what to do and how we're going to move forward. So with that, we had to get our gears in action and try to understand what is two-spirit identity, first of all. So when we looked at two-spirit identity in Mi'kmaq, it doesn't make sense. There is no such thing as two-spirit identity in my language. It doesn't interpret the same way. It doesn't translate either. So it is a pan-Indigenous concept. However, it does come from the spirit of knowledge from someone that had visions with that, and they said, they acknowledged the fact that these 7 spirits came and they recognized one of them as being two-spirit or two spirits. And that's not necessarily our conceptualization. That is not our teaching. But we have to understand still, what is it that it's about identity and sexuality and who we are as Mi'kmaq people that is important. So one of our tasks to understand what is suicide ideation, if there was a link between suicide and coming out, that we had to understand who we are as well with that. So we went and explored identity. My process in this was, I'm finishing up a master. In fact, I'm just done to my editing stage, and I'm presenting my master's on two-spirit identity on December 5th. But the results are there, and the other piece is the suicide ideation story, coming out stories that I came 2 years ago, I think it was, and I said we're going to do this project. Now I'm coming back to make that circle in full view so that we have the results from that study. But in doing so, we had to go back into our culture and try to understand who the hell we are, basically. And in doing so, again, we had to look at what is our worldview. Ulnui Dasim, or Ulnue, means who we are and where we come from. So the concept of two-spirit is still an umbrella term. And it is something that represents various gender identities, trans, gender fluid, multiple non-conforming identities, or genderless. It could also mean and includes gender identity with sexuality, and sexuality and they intersect. And in that, it includes, this is the most important part, that identifies identity with the rest of us, being Indigenous people, is that there's an historical, cultural, and spiritual context in our identity that's distinct to LGBTQ contexts. So it's not the same. So when people want to acknowledge themselves as two-spirit, and people often say, I'm white, could I say I'm two-spirited? Well, then you have to ask yourself, do you belong to the same context of historical, linguistic, and spiritual experiences that we have had? So that's important, and I say it and I confirm that in my study. Mindug are spirits. And what we say is that Mindug are part of who we are, and they are part of what makes our identity. But there's this core part of identity that needs to be understood. And that's part of what I'm exploring as the worldview that we're using is something that will explain that. The thing that's happened is that we, Mi'kmaq, in our territory, have been dealing with colonial and settler structures far ahead, more time than, let's say, a lot of the prairie tribes or in BC nations, for example, by 200 or 300 years. So we've had, member to one of our chiefs was baptized in 1609. And we've just celebrated 400 years of that in our culture. And we had integrated those worldviews. So in doing this study, we had to look at perspectives that were both indigenous and non-indigenous. We had to combine that two-eyed seeing approach, which is a method that really is used in research, so that we would understand that there's a colonial structure of worldview that also influenced the cultural perspectives that we have, and that produces a new worldview. So when we look at the product of Mindug being part of our identity, it's very different to understand that from a conceptualization from our language, for example. So in our ancestral teachings, because we don't have ancestral teachings around two-spirit identity or anything similar, we had to go back and hypothesize what it would have been viewed as. A person that would have been trans 500 years ago, pre-colonial times, we had to reconstruct that. And we do it through research. But there is no, and I can acknowledge this, and it's the first time that's being done in our region, I can acknowledge the fact that there is no ancestral knowledge around it. We've tried through traditional knowledge, oral traditions, even language, but it doesn't exist. But it doesn't mean that we don't exist. So that's the difference. So what we're trying to do is that in understanding our nationhood and our identity, we look going back to our ancestral knowledge of kinship and relationship and how we identify ourselves as people and persons before we identify ourselves as gender and sexuality. So this is the concept that I came up with that identifies our identity as a two-spirit person. It comes from ancient knowledge of who we are, and we have to look at the contemporary expressions of that through sexuality and gender. But your first and foremost understanding of who you are is that amigma, or the word ulnu means person or human or identity. So before anything, I am that identity. But then we incorporate throughout life other identities. Those individuals' inner spirits are characteristics or markers that come out eventually within the body and externally of the body. And they make up the wholeness of that person. So what happens is that these identities are in constant flux and in negotiation, like kinship. And they'll only come out when they are safe, both internally and externally, in those spheres of mental, physical, emotional, and physical parts. So we have to make sure that those 4 quadrants of colors that you see, for example, are those spheres of those areas that have to be in balance. And this is not a foreign concept, because we know that for a person to come out, they have to be in their right frame of mind, spiritually, internally, and whatever else that you have. But what we're saying is that those spirits are always negotiating with each other inside our bodies, so that those mindug, the word for spirits, can come out and balance themselves so that they can be expressed as trans or gay or lesbian. So that's what we're trying to explain as a conceptualization of worldview. We have to start from somewhere. So we have to look at our worldview, conceptualization of that, and contemporary structures of understanding what gender means, as in gay, lesbian, bi. I don't see people as gay or lesbian or bisexual. I just see people as people. It's the language that we use and the contextualization in a modern setting that we identify, you're gay, you're bisexual, trans, you're that. But we don't see it that way. We see it as that you're all ulnug. So when those circumstances of identity are in balance, then they'll reach their sense of wholeness. And in that life cycle, in our sacred teachings, you will eventually come out who you are within that model of identity. So, for example, if you have someone, it says here, love, honesty, humility, respect, truth, patience, and wisdom. Wisdom is the last thing that will come out. And before wisdom, you have to have humility. But at certain parts, and according to our elders, they say every 7 years there's an interruption of who you are. And that makes sense, because when you're a child, for example, you start gendering, or you're being gendered according to construct at school. when you go to school when you're 5, 6, and 7. So that's the first interruption of that process. Then when you get to puberty around 12, 13, and 14, then it's the next stage of life where the physical and the hormonal are working with each other. Is gender starting to come up? Yes, it is. So that's how we explain it, and that's how we're trying to teach it and resurface that knowledge so that we use it in a conceptualization that is meaningful to our young people. So the coming out stories, basically, what it did for us is develop that knowledge and put it together so that's significant to our people. So the 20 narratives, to some people, they're just stories. They were not stories. I witnessed these stories personally when I went there and I talked to these people. And we sat there. Before we could even talk about identity, we would have to establish a relationship and kinship. For researchers, it's when you go into a community, you try to do research in a business fashion. We can't do it that way. And we will never do it that way. We have to sit there and establish that sense of kinship before we could even ask any questions. So it takes a little longer. So we had the 10 urban, 10 non-urban. We went into the part where we discovered 18 out of 20 talked about resilience. And then we also looked at the process by which people came out. It was friend, sibling, family, and community. So a lot of that made sense to our folks that were involved in community or in urban settings. These are some of the findings. And if you look at the findings there, they're a bunch of numbers. And for a person that looks at stats, that's beautiful. That doesn't mean anything to me, however. I mean, they're looking at all these beautiful, percentages, and they're looking at that these are, stats that give a mean or a medium of something. Like the red over here, 70% of participants were 13 and 19 age. The total of people that attempted suicide was that. Well, we didn't capitalize on that knowledge. What we see there are stories of people. That's what the distinction of what doing research with our communities is. So we had to make sure that that was foremost the most important thing. So these are some of the findings we just had. Those are just results. As far as I'm concerned, they're just stats. But behind these stories is what resilience and hope comes from when it comes to looking at how we're going to build that identity and make sure that mental health is something that we secure as a process that's cultural and that's based on our language and it's based on our worldview. That's when it's meaningful. Otherwise, it's just numbers. So again, we have all these numbers. But the biggest things that we came out of this research and looking at this experience was to say, what are those recommendations from this research? One was to do more research. Research in a colonial perspective, but also research in collecting stories from our perspective. We have to make sure that policy development and implementation of those policies move forward. We're doing that already. Community supports are built, and we're doing that in our communities as we speak, where for the first time 2 years ago and then last year, we had one community do pride events, and they acknowledged the fact that there were chiefs walking in these pride events. And last year, last June or July, the Halifax Pride, we submitted a float for the first time, and everybody was very supportive. They said, oh, great, Indians are going to be walking in their tribal outfits and everything. But what it really was for us, it was a spiritual journey, and we led the actual parade. So that was an extraordinary experience because we had leadership, we had children, and we had all kinds of two-spirits and allies come and lead this parade for the first time ever in Atlantic Canada. That was more meaningful to us as building that relationship. So we need peer supports. Based on our research, we now realize that kids help other kids. That's the most important part to this. The resilience model that we're looking at is that through our language and cultural identity, we can move forward. We need more action. And we understand that. Action involves doing more research, talking with people, building relationships, and to make sure that we build our relationship based on our Wabanaki Two-Spirit Alliance on peace and friendship. And our involvement in Halifax, for example, with the Pride movement is only one element. And as a small anecdote, when Pride had said, we want the Wabanaki Two-Spirit Alliance to come and acknowledge land territory and do some sort of ceremony. And we said, well, let's switch it around a little bit. I said, Halifax Pride is part of our territory. And you have to understand that you only are part of our guested territory. We will dictate how that process is. And it was very humbling for Pride Halifax to even say, yeah, you're right. Because it took a long time to get to that point where we had to build that relationship and lead that process of peace and friendship. So the biggest recommendation that we have as Wabanaki 2 Super Alliance from this is the fact that we invite everybody to work with us as partners, collaborators, and leaders in this research to move forward. So these are just some stats again. They tell a story. But when we move forward, I just want to share this one word that we have. It's called gistaleg. Gistaleg is a word that we had that said, it's an ancient word that said, not an ancient word, it's a contemporary word used from an ancient context that said, when you are a person, that person, deleg, means the state of being. Gistaleg, the word gist that puts it into a perspective, means the unique one. So it was used in negative connotation because of religion and colonial powers, but then we're in the process of rescuing that word and saying Dan deleg a gistaleg, which would mean the uniqueness of that identity. And we have to resurface that language belief that we can do that. And that's what we're trying to do right now. And Give Me Delsi is another word that came forward. These children are self-identified as children that said that I am gistaleg. And they're moving forward and saying they are part of our identity and our culture. That is what we're trying to do with our research, is to make sure that we acknowledge resilience, we acknowledge the hope that goes with our sense of worldview, and that only cultural identity will make sure that suicide ideation and suicide and mental health will move forward. Thank you.
Thank you so much, John. Is this on? Thanks, John. We have time for one or two questions for John. Please come to one of the mics in the aisle to ask your question.
Or we can talk in the bathroom later.
Any questions?
It was clear.
Very clear. I thought your statistics were beautiful, John. Very beautiful. I will defend your statistics. I guess I'm curious about the process of presenting the work back out east, and if what kinds of reactions have you gotten from either some of the First Nations communities there, or from pride groups, or what's the reaction been like?
The most important validation process is bringing it back to community, and acknowledging elders, and making sure that we take it back to elders. And some of the elders had said, we don't agree. And that we said, that's okay, because we still have to move forward. And if we don't agree, we'll have to still find a common ground somewhere for the well-being of our young people. And that's the most important. And they agree with that, and we agree with that, and that's where we will work towards that idea. And that validation process was that in opening that discussion. And there hasn't been anything written on this stuff. So it's a first in exploring this identity from a gender and sexuality type of thing. One of our elders, back in about 1980 or 1980 something, somebody had asked her, because she was a widow, and her first husband had died, so she married again and had a second husband, and they called her Dr. Granny, and she said, somebody had asked her, so where would you like to be buried if you're going to die, with your first husband or your second husband? And she said, in between them, because I want to have continued sex when I die. So everybody was like, oh my God, what did she say? And it was just bringing, in that instant, it brought back sexuality and the talk about sexuality in a positive light with humor. And that's what we need to do, is continue talking about what gender and sexuality means to us. Yes?
Take one more question.
I just wanted to say, I had the great opportunity of talking with you twice this workshop, and I really appreciated hearing what you were talking about, and I really absolutely love what you presented here and the terms that you worked out, and it's powerfully understanding and inclusive. So I just we can't have you come all the way out here and not thank you for this great gift of healing, this great gift of ancestry. Thank you.
Okay, one last question. Yeah, go ahead, Jazzy.
Hi, I'm Jazzy. I guess the question that I have is, I feel like in the indigenous populations, this idea of narratives and sharing stories is quite well established for centuries, generations.
Thousands of years.
Thousands of generations. In the stint of time that I worked in the interior as Gay Men's Health Initiative project coordinator, I was finding that youth were not really that interested in engaging with the elders of the community for fear, because their experience was that the elders were basically looking at them like chicken hawk. Mm-hmm. And my question is, do you have any tips or tricks on how to bridge that gap so that some of this oral tradition can be maintained in the mainstream?
Mm. What we've seen is it's very similar problems have happened with youth and miscommunication between youth and elders, and really it's finding that common ground and bringing, like cultural activities bring people together, music, chant, drumming, dance, and finding that celebration is what will bring us together, and communication will evolve, can't be forced, but it'll evolve. So building that relationship again and having more cultural ceremony, more cultural activities, and more cultural communication take place, then that kinship will take place as well. Yeah.
Thank you.
It's a long process and it's slow sometimes, but we can't put a linear time frame on it. Yeah. Thank you.
One really quick question from my friend Dion.
Hi, Dion Gessing from the University of Toronto. I just wanted to ask about whether or not there would be opportunity or room, or if this is something you're going to do in the future around maybe rites of passage programs for youth that have two-spirited identities, or the variety, the spectrum of identities, and yeah. Thanks.
I think we're still in the process of exploring contemporary settings around what our cultural identity is. I have to go on and continue this study, probably in PhD, and I already know what I'll do is resurface our language or start new positive language around identity and start exploring how that makes sense in our ceremonial practices that we may not have. That ceremony that I had yesterday was a powerful ceremony. And just because it's not a Mi'kmaq ceremony, that doesn't diminish the spiritual side of that ceremony that we can absolutely bring back to the surface. So rites of passage is just one ceremony we could do. There's many, many more that we could do. Yeah. Thank you.
Okay, join me in thanking John one more time for his excellent talk.